Welcome to the Deeper Podcast, a ministry of Crossroads Church, a multi-site church in Mansfield, Ohio. This podcast is meant to help you go deeper in God's Word and grow deeper in life application. Now join our host, pastor and author, Dave Vance.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Deeper Podcast. My name is Chris Standridge, and I'm your host. And sitting next to me is Dave Vance, lead pastor of Crossroads Church in Mansfield, Ohio. And today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about another character in the New Testament who attempted to cancel Christ. You know, it's interesting when you think about cancel culture. A lot of times when we talk about the woke culture that surrounds us today, we almost we think about the fact that they kind of want to cancel just about everything, and we try to villainize people that are a part of the woke culture. It's almost as if woke culture is all inherently evil all the time because, you know, maybe they canceled something that we appreciate, something that we value, something that we may disagree with them about. You know, you think about Mr. Potato Head and Dr. Seuss, who have both been canceled recently, and we just inherently think, oh man, cancel culture is all evil all the time. But, you know, it's really easy, Dave, to throw out good guy and bad guy labels and just label someone, right, they're all good or they're all bad all the time. But that's not always the case when it comes with cancel culture. So I actually wanted to ask you as we get started into the podcast today, can you think of maybe a person or maybe an offender or an instance or a stereotype in our history that has been canceled where society actually got it right?
Yeah, and there have been many, many times this has happened. And I you know, the level between what is cancel culture and what is just doing what is right is sometimes difficult to ascertain. Like, you know, cancel culture can certainly, all good things can have shadow sides to them. Yeah. But let's just think of a couple groups of people or people that have been canceled that are actually good. Like, for example, those with you know, racist issues, the KKK, for example. I think the idea of shutting down anything that pictures racism or that speaks racism, that goes against the law of God in the sense of love and equality, I think is very important in the sense of racism. Mm-hmm. So systemic racism that people might demonstrate, I think it's good to cancel that. And I think it's been interesting to watch people be held accountable for what they've said about racism. Yeah. Now, some of those people have gotten it right and they've changed, but some of those people in a fresh way have said it. And I appreciate that it doesn't matter your background. If you say those things and you act that way, you're going to be called out. You're going to be canceled. You know, we go back in history and there certainly have been enemies and people of evil that have been canceled. You know, I think of one of the things that stands out to me is the U.S. Olympics. And you remember all the gymnasts, many of them that have been abused. Yeah. You know, it was time to bring safety to the voice of those who have been abused to say something was wrong and this happened to me. Yeah. And, you know, shame on us that we didn't have a place for that. And so when we talk about being woke, they were awakened to opportunity and freedom to say, I've been abused. Mm-hmm. And I think we do well to cancel those people, right? They deserve punishment. They deserve prison for what they've done. And so there's things like that I think are very powerful, and in a sense, a good thing because it calls accountability. Certainly it can go too far, but there's been some good things as a result of that. And one of them has been to talk about racism and really deal with racism and really learn how to deal with racism. I don't think we've solved that. Right. And then also things like abuse. You think about the U.S. Olympic gymnastics team and what many of them have faced. That needs to be called out. Yeah. It was absolutely wrong.
Yeah. So not everything about this cancel culture is all bad all the time. And you know, that leads us to the character that we're going to talk about in our podcast today, which is an extension of Sunday's sermon. We're going to talk about Peter. And as one of the 12, Peter was probably the most zealous for Christ and for his mission. But he was also used by the enemy as a tool to try to cancel Christ at the same time. Give us a little snapshot into who Peter was and how he was both good and bad in some ways, but certainly not bad all of the time.
Yeah, if you go back to the beginning of his calling, he's a fisherman. Mm-hmm. But he's not only a fisherman, it seems that he's the lead fisherman. He may be the boat owner, or he may have some say, most likely one of the older disciples. As a result of that, there was very much a culture of honor among those who were older. Mm-hmm. So potentially one one of the older disciples. We're not absolutely sure of that, but we can guess that based upon the honor they bestowed upon him. He was the one that said, hey, let's go fishing. And Jesus called him in that moment of fishing where they were out all night, didn't catch anything. And then Jesus says, hey, go out and take your nets to the deep. It says they were cleaning their nets. They were already finished work. They were done. And they go back out and they catch fish in a way that they did not expect, and abundance of fish. And Jesus says, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. And there was this calling that Peter had. We see in Matthew chapter 16 when Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And they answered, some say Elijah, some say they're the prophets. And then he says, who do you say that I am? And Peter was the first to respond and seemed to be that leader, that one in charge. And he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds and says, on this rock I will build my church, Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon son of Jonah, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I believe that rock is the declaration of Peter that he will make eventually the gospel message that he'll proclaim after the resurrection. So we see this guy who is a leader. And then just before the betrayal happens, just before they go to the garden, Jesus again foretells his death. And in Matthew 26, we see that they're getting ready to go out to the Mount of Olives to sing, and he says, I'm going to fall away from you. And the picture is they're walking to the Mount of Olives after the Last Supper, and Jesus is having this conversation saying, you know what, you're going to fall away from me as a result of what's going to happen to me. They're going to strike the shepherd, and you're going to fall away. And Peter responds and says, though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. And Jesus then predicts, well, on this night, you're going to deny me 3 times and the rooster will crow. I think it's really interesting that Peter here, you see the fortitude and the faithfulness, and he is diehard about following Jesus, so much so that Jesus says, you're all going to fall away from me. And Peter says, oh, they may. And I think it's really interesting, the pronouns there, they will, but I won't. And he's saying all these other disciples, they might, not me. Yeah. I'm going to put the stake in the sand, and I'm going to follow you wherever you go.
Yeah. So Peter had some real deep roots of faith, and he was zealous for Jesus, his rabbi, his teacher, his Lord. But he also had some blind spots that kind of let him get caught up into the hysteria of believing that the Messiah's mission was different than it actually was. How did Peter's misunderstanding, Dave, of Christ's mission cause him to play a role in canceling Christ?
Yeah, and we find this out here where Jesus again predicts his death, and then he says, no, but I'm not going to deny you. Even though Jesus has already proven he is going to be the one to tell them what they're going to do, right? Jesus knows them better than they know themselves. And then we see him certainly denying him at the trials, and we see this take place. And so Jesus, knowing us better than we know ourselves, Peter disconnected what he wanted from Jesus to the mission of Jesus. And I think in all of us there are kind of these blind spots in us at times too, where I think sometimes our good qualities also have a shadow side to them. And I think it's interesting for most of us, if we were to pick out our greatest weaknesses, I bet you there's a direct connection to our greatest strengths. There is a connection. I think for Peter, being a zealous man, and maybe zealous over the mission that he thought Jesus was going to do, which was overthrow Rome, his zealous attitude actually led him to denial, because he didn't see that he wasn't seeing this clearly, that the mission was not clear in front of him, that he didn't understand that Jesus had to die. And I think for some of us, those blind spots can sneak into our greatest weaknesses. They're the vulnerabilities that tend to stand out, that the enemy knows well, and he's going to prick those. And so I think we do well to think about these blind spots, and I think it proves that sometimes we have these blind spots about God's mission in our own lives. We question the sovereignty of God. We question, what is God asking me to do in this situation? And we begin to see our blind spots rise to the occasion. And I think it's easy to see Peter and just we pile onto him, but we all have the same mindset. Our strengths can be our greatest shadows.
It's definitely easy to jump on that bandwagon pile on to Peter and say, man, how did this guy not get it? How did he miss the boat so bad? How did he not see that Jesus knew what he was going to do and he still denied him yet? But we also have the privilege of 20/20 hindsight, and we can always see clearly that way. And all of us have those blind spots, just like you mentioned. How would you recommend, Dave, not only discovering blind spots in our own lives, but once we discover what they are, how to eliminate them?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, and a whole book could be written on that alone. And it's interesting that you connected it to mission. I want to go back to that question that we get in that same pattern as Peter, who denied Jesus, so much so that he not only denies him but curses. He puts a curse on himself over it, and he curses the fact that he doesn't even know the man, and the rooster crows. And I think that idea of we get caught up in life, in what we think life should be, that we miss the mission of God, which is what our lives should be about as Christians. And we get caught up in the blind spots becoming our clear spots. Mm-hmm. Our blind spots become what we clearly see. And for Peter, I believe this blind spot that he didn't even know he had became his clear vision. And that's the problem, is these blind spots become vision. So a couple of things. First of all, how we overcome them. I think we have to ask God to reveal them to us. Yeah. I think prayer is a powerful weapon to our blind spots by saying, God, search me and know me. God, see if there's any blind spot in me. I think of that psalm. Search me, know me, see if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me into the way of everlasting and the way of righteousness. I wonder if we do well to say, God, show me my blind spots. I would bet I would look at your strengths. What are the strengths that you have? And then tie the strength back to what could be a weakness. I think we do well to know, where do I feel strong, and could there be a chink in the armor or a vulnerable spot in the midst of that? And then one of the things that I think we have to do is constantly live in a state of repentance over our weaknesses. And what I mean by that is constantly turning away from the potential of our blind spots being played out. Yeah. We all have them. For some, maybe your blind spot is going to be a relationship, or for others, maybe your blind spot is going to be a greed that you have. Yeah. Maybe it's going to be a bit of pride. Maybe it's going to be control. And your blind spot is that you like to control things. And so when something happens, you white knuckle it and you take control of it. And what God is going to call you to is surrender. And I think what's interesting is where there's a blind spot, if you draw that line back to that vulnerability, now you're going to see, oh, I've got to react this way. I've got to react in surrender if I like control. If it's a sinful tendency, I'm going to act in a way of caution. I'm going to pay attention to this. If it's reaction, I'm going to be a little cautious, and instead of being quick to respond, I'm going to be slow to speak. I start to think about it the opposite direction. For Peter, it would have been interesting for him to take a pause and say, Jesus, what do you mean we're all going to fall away? What if he had prayed that, in a sense,
instead of
jumping in? What if he had said, hey, I really don't want to fall away. How do I make sure this doesn't happen? He doesn't do that. And of course, Christ is sovereign over the fact that he wasn't going to do that. But he didn't do that. Instead, he went right to the jugular. I will not deny. And even when he's denying, he doesn't even realize he's fulfilling exactly what Jesus said. He doesn't realize it until the rooster crows. Now, you would think this is the same night of the betrayal. You would think that he's thinking, I'm not going to deny. I'm not going to deny. I'm not going to deny.
Yeah.
But what does he do? He just so easily and casually denies. You know why? Because in the heat of the moment, he cared more about himself than he did what Jesus had told him. And I think the same is true for us. We can tend to care more about ourselves than what God may reveal as our blind spots. And that's why we have to cut them out. We have to get some discipline in place to hopefully not go toward that.
Yeah. And I love Peter's story for those very reasons. Like he like you said earlier, he was a guy who went all in. When it was answering the call of Jesus, he left his business, he left his family to follow the rabbi. He was all in. When it was walking on water, he jumped out of the boat. He was all in. If it was seeing Jesus transfigured on the mountain, he wanted to tabernacle there. Like, he was all in. When it was in the garden, he pulled his sword and he wanted to fight. He was all in. He was one of those guys that just gave it everything he had. And unfortunately, when it came to denying Christ, he did that with gusto as well. Like you said, he did it casually. He didn't even stop to think because he was so invested in that moment that he denied his Savior 3 times. And so Peter fell. He fell pretty hard. He fell pretty fast. And what I love about his story is that it's not the end. It's not the end. There's ultimately forgiveness, there's redemption, and there's even a commissioning by Christ, if you will. And I think that for most of us, we identify with Peter's story because there's a prodigal in each of us.
Right.
There's a denier in each of us. And every one of us have been put on that spot in some form or fashion along the way in our journey with Christ where we've missed an opportunity or we've denied Christ, whether it was intentional or unintentional. And so we've all kind of played this prodigal just like Peter did. But there's hope for us as we look at Peter's story. And there's hope for us to know that Christ isn't done just because we missed an opportunity or because we denied him. And so how can God use our failures, our denials, and even our cancellations to commission us to gospel advancement today?
Yeah, and I think it's important to see this is exactly what Jesus does to Peter. In John 21, we see the end of the story. And John, an eyewitness, wants us to see that Jesus came, and he already had appeared to the disciples already, but he comes specifically on the Sea of Tiberias, and he comes right when they're fishing, and he makes breakfast for them, and he tells them this, and I want to read these words. He says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He's talking about these fish and more than the other disciples even. And he says to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He says, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And he said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was grieved because he said it the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and another will dress you." And so then Jesus says, "Hey, you're going to die and someone else is going to dress you and they're going to carry you where you don't want to go." And then after this saying, he said, "Follow me." I find it interesting that Jesus comes right back after saying to him, "Do you love me?" And by the way, there's a really interesting interchange in the words. Do you love me? Do you agape me? Do you sacrificially love me? And Peter responds actually with "I phileo," I brotherly love you. And Peter here is cautious to make the same commitment. So he's learning about his mistakes. And then Jesus comes back after saying this 3 times. Jesus comes back with the same words that he began this ministry with Peter with. And he says, "Follow me, follow me." And I think it's interesting. We all have those failures. We all have those denials. We all have those moments where we don't respond the way we should respond. We don't surrender the way we should surrender. We have those moments where our circumstances seem to cancel Christ in a specific moment. And here is God who says, "Okay, do you get what you've done? Do you realize who I am? Follow me. Follow me. Get back up. Come on back to me. Let's keep going." And for Peter, he became the spokesperson of the gospel in the book of Acts. He became the leader of the church of Jerusalem. He became the one by which the gospel went out to the nations. He became the one to lead the church into the future. And it was in this moment where Jesus recommissioned him. And I believe every one of us can be recommissioned. And for Peter, he had to answer this question again. And that's the point, is I think for some of us, we have to answer the question again. Will we follow him in this moment? Will we follow him in this season? And Peter could unequivocally say, "Yes, I'm willing to go. I'm willing to go wherever you send me. I'm willing to even die for you." And this time, Jesus says, "You will die." And I think for us, it's real important that we realize Jesus, in his grace, offers us that opportunity again. It says, "Follow me." Just like in the beginning. "Follow me, I'll make you fishers of men." Follow me now. I want to make you what you were never with in those blind spots, but what now you can be.
Yeah, and that brings hope for the believer today, because very, very few of us live this linear trajectory toward Christ where it's just constantly growth and positive instances and positive interactions and all these things. For a lot of us, it's deep valleys and high hills, and sometimes it just looks like this. And that was kind of Peter's experience. But in the end, he persevered.
He did.
And that brings all of us hope if we can persevere to the end as well. And so, man, that's a really good stopping point for this this episode, Dave. I appreciate you so much for shepherding us through this, for teaching us through this, and giving us some insight into Scripture. And so, thanks for joining us today, everybody. We're so glad that you clicked on this episode of the podcast. We'll have a new one next week as well, so we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Deeper Podcast. To listen to more content or get more info, visit crossroadswired.com or PastorDaveVance.com.